I mentioned this book last week, but this will be virtually everything we're talking about this morning is coming out of this book, and I would recommend this. It's a unique book. It's sort of a blending together. It's partially biography of this guy, partially a sort of an introduction to the Chinese house church, and it's also a big chunk of the book is made up of his actual writings, which have been translated into English, specifically on the topic of political theology. And so, just to review, in case you weren't here last week, you might be a little disoriented. We spent last week on a kind of a strange tour, beginning in Central Europe in 1400, and noting how different the world was, how different nation states were. And we traveled through East Africa, which in many ways still functions like this. And then we were trying to trace the growth of the modern nation state, because I think we tend to just assume the world has always been like it is now. And that's actually very much not true. The modern nation state is a relatively new thing in the world. By new, I mean about 400 years old. But still, many places in the world that still don't operate under modern nation states. And so we looked at kind of that process of change, and we noted that the modern nation state, America is a modern nation state, it presents a unique form of an ancient temptation, which is idolatry, because the modern nation state tempts us to think that most of the good things that happen to us or the bad things that happen to us are the result of things that are done in Washington or not done in Washington, D.C. And the modern nation state, like most idols, it demands more and more and more from us, and delivers less and less and less from us as time goes along. And one of the things it demands the most is our attention. Whether that attention is good or bad sometimes doesn't matter. It just really wants our attention, and it's really good at consuming our attention. One of the challenges I want to wrestle with is how we as Christians can find our identity, our meaning, our purpose, our sense of significance in who we are, our joy, finding it in God, and finding it our primary identity in the church, rather than being as emotionally consumed, good or bad, by what's happening in our national capital. Rather than letting my hopes and fears ride the roller coaster of national electoral politics, especially every 4 years, right? We looked very early on, the very first few weeks of this class, we asked, how can we view our national government more like plumbing in my house, which is important and necessary, but not something I want to worship, and less like sort of Marvel superheroes or supervillains, and something that we just are all consumed in. Does that make sense? So what did that have to do with this guy in China? I made the argument last week that China, perhaps more than any other nation state on earth, has perfected the art of being everything, of being godlike in their realm. So they promise uber competency, right? Competency to micromanage everyone's life in everything, be it education, be it the economy, be it whatever, the media, whatever sector of of the nation you want to talk about, they control it. There are no intermediary institutions. By intermediary institutions, I mean there's no church that is independent, right? There are no non-governmental organizations that are independent. There are no, to have a meeting with more than 3 people, you need to have a permit. So you can't have a PTA meeting. You can't have it's not just religion. You can't have a gathering legally for anything, right? You can't have an organization for anything. There are no Kiwanis clubs or Knights of Columbus or whatever organization you can think of. They're not allowed to exist, right? Because the government says we will do everything. So they are sort of the reductio ad absurdum, the ultimate in terms of the modern nation state. So this gentleman, Pastor Wang Yi, he's a Chinese house church pastor who has really thought through political theology in a really deep way. And he's thought through it in a context where his national government of China promises unprecedented levels of competency and demands unprecedented levels of worship. Maybe the last phrase isn't true, because Rome demanded worship of Caesar in the late stages of Rome. That's how they sorted out, you paying a pinch of incense to the emperor. So maybe that's not as new, demanding ultimate worship from your citizens. But Sandy and I lived in the same city as this gentleman from 2008 to 2010. And I'm just really struck by his grasp of the history of political theology. Like, he's done a tremendous, I don't know how he got a hold of some of these sources, but he's obviously grappled deeply with the history of church history and the history of political theology in the church. I think that his wrestling through in his context gives us maybe some fresh eyes on our own context. And so that's why we're spending some time looking at his writings. So just a bit about his personal biography. He was born not a Christian, not in a Christian home. Born in 1973 in a small town in Sichuan province, which is pretty far western China, southwest China. 1996, he graduated from Sichuan Law School and began teaching law as a really young man at Chengdu University, which is a fairly prestigious university in China. He must have been a little bit of a natural, I think, rebel at heart, maybe his whole life, because early on, he became pretty involved in a secular sense in the human rights advocacy in China, writing for Chinese magazines that were kind of trying to push the envelope. There was a window in time in China from basically, 1990 to 2015, when there was a relatively large amount of freedom to operate. That's actually the little window that we were in China during that window. And that has since pretty much been closed back down. It's a lot more strict today than it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And so he was operating in an environment that was a little bit more open at that time, the most open maybe it had ever been. He became a columnist in 2003. Again, he's not a believer yet. Became a columnist for China News Weekly and began to attract quite a bit of attention for kind of being a guy who was pushing the envelope with human rights issues in China. In 2004, he was named by a Hong Kong magazine, one of the 50 most influential public intellectuals. He was the youngest of the 50 people on that list. It was also about this time he started having conversations with Christians. He was not yet a Christian. And in 2005, he converted to Christianity, was baptized into the church. 2006, he was invited to meet with President Bush at the White House. Again, he's already reached a pretty prominent position as a representative of China's Christian intellectuals. He had obviously done a lot of study on Christianity before he became a Christian, because the speed at which, he's obviously a super brilliant guy, but the speed at which he kind of grasped onto the depth of the Christian theological tradition is pretty remarkable. 2008, he returned to D.C., awarded the prize for contribution to promoting religious freedom. 2008, he resigned his professorship at Chengdu University and founded a church in Chengdu. Chengdu is a city of about 15 million. It's sort of the de facto capital of Western China, Southwest China. Big modern city. So he was the founding pastor. That church quickly grew to 600 members, about 800 attenders. In 10 years, it grew to that size. And they planted a number of daughter churches throughout the region and started a school that went from preschool all the way through to postgraduate theological school. So obviously a really high capacity guy. And of course, all of this was incredibly fragile and tenuous, and they knew that. Another big thing that happened is, I don't have on the deal here, but 2015 is when Xi Jinping came to power as the new president, new chairman of China. And Xi Jinping, China had had a series of presidents that were rotating every 5 years. There were basically three factions. I mean, people think of the Communist Party as this one thing, but of course there are rivalries and factions within the party. And there were three rival factions, and they had been rotating power nicely between the three of them for about 20 years-ish. And when Xi Jinping came to power, he said, no more rotation, it's just staying with me. And he appointed himself president for life, and he cast himself much more in the tradition of Chairman Mao, and which was a dangerous thing to do for him, because he has now two angry factions who really don't like him. So as a result, he put the screws to everything throughout society to crank down control and pressure on everything, because he was playing a really risky game. It still wouldn't surprise me to wake up one morning and learn that he has disappeared, because one of the other factions has managed to eliminate him. But so far that hasn't happened. So far he's pulled it off. But anyway, as a result of him coming to power in 2015, that's when things really began to lock back down. And the state, the Chinese state, has acquired technological capabilities of monitoring people in a way that Mao only would have dreamed of, or the emperors only would have dreamed of, right? So anyway, as part of that general cranking down on freedoms throughout the country, the church was one among many things that got cranked down. And so Christian churches during the 90s and 2000s and early 2010s were a lot of them were able to operate with a lot of leeway. Even unregistered quote-unquote house churches. Some of them in Beijing had grown to over 1,000 people. They were meeting publicly in rented hotel ballrooms, but meeting very openly and publicly. But that all came kind of to a screeching halt around 2015, as Xi Jinping was kind of accumulating power to himself. He was shutting those things down. So I won't go into this whole backstory, but China has had a governmental body. Think of the Department of Transportation or Department of Education. They've had a Department of Religion that is responsible for keeping religion in check, right? Keeping it under control and keeping it monitored. And China said, we will allow religious freedom if you come under the umbrella of that Department of Religious Affairs. You can meet as a church, but you must register, and you must, there's a series of restrictions that they place on registered churches. And churches which refuse to come under that umbrella of the TSPM face destruction. I mean, they're illegal if they don't come under that umbrella. And about 70% roughly of Chinese Christians were meeting in unregistered churches. About 30% were meeting in these legal registered churches. Although there's quite a bit of cross-pollination between the two, more than people realize. But Wang Yi, Pastor Wang, Wang is in China, the family name comes first. So Wang is his family name, so I'll refer to him as Pastor Wang. His response to the government saying, you need to come under our registration, his response was to say, no, thank you. We're going to remain unregistered, and we're not going to be secret. We're not going to be private. We'll tell you where we meet. We'll tell you when we meet. We will wear name tags. We're coming through the front door, not through the back door. And obviously with 800 people on a Sunday morning, they're not secret, right? And they did not ever intend to be secret. They wanted to be a public-facing church. Yeah.
That's the thing, I did get the book, and that's the thing that really sort of spoke to me. Why don't you just hide and keep your,
Yeah.
But he was so adamant that this should be out in the open.
So a huge part of his theology is, we'll come to this in a minute, but his favorite Bible passage is Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20, where Christ is supreme over all things, heaven and earth. And he says, if that's true, then Jesus isn't just something in my the church. The government wants to say, you can have your religion, just do it in your private heart and mind. And he says, no, Jesus is king over everything, including this nation, including these dictators. So we are not going to act like we're doing this in private, in secret, in a corner. We're going to be out front, come what may, right? And so, he rejected the term underground church for theological reasons. He said the church is not meant to be hidden under a basket. Yeah.
So with that many people, where were they meeting?
They were meeting in rented hotel lobbies, like a conference room at a big ballroom in a hotel.
Obviously, okay.
Yeah. Now the government began to pressure the hotels to shut them down, which is what happened. So the hotel said, sorry, we can't rent our space to you anymore. So then they started meeting in parks, and then we'll see what happened eventually. You can kind of imagine where this is going. And he had to know. I mean, he didn't know Xi Jinping was going to come to power and tighten everything down. But once once Xi Jinping did come to power, everybody could kind of see the writing on the wall where this was eventually going and where it has eventually gone. So he preferred the term unregistered rather than underground for theological reasons. And it's not a house church when you're 800 people because you can't fit in anybody's house, right? He said that, the church must not hide her light under a basket. And so he was, in December 9th of 2018, he was arrested along with all of the church leadership and hundreds of church members, and all of their church property was either destroyed on the spot or confiscated. So So 1 year later, so he was in custody, police custody, for all of 2019, and at the end of 2019, he was sentenced to a 9-year prison sentence. And the charges were subversion of state power, I believe, which is not necessarily inaccurate according to his theology. So we're going to look at his theology, and there's a lot more details in your notes than I'm just going to hit the high points on the slides here. Before we get to that, any thoughts or questions or clarification about? Yeah.
Okay, you said earlier there were
Two wings of the church. Mm-hmm.
right. So what are they? Are they positives or negatives?
So that's a really, Greta asked, there's two parts of the church, those who are registered with the government, called registered churches, and those who are unregistered. Traditionally, we called them house churches, but that's not always an accurate label. So 70% in the unregistered, about 30% in the registered, although a lot of people went to services in both. Maybe a Wednesday service in an open church and a Sunday service in a unregistered church. Are they good or bad? It's hard to... when we were living in China, we, once a month, made a 2-hour bus ride one way up to a city that had the closest registered church. And we attended there once a month. We didn't attend underground, unregistered churches for the obvious reason that we would have brought them unwanted attention, right? So my sense when we were there is that a lot of the people in the registered church did love Jesus, were trying to do their best, were trying to kind of get in where they could fit in, not rock the boat too much. At that point in time, there was a law. Well, there still is. There was a law against having Sunday school for children anyone under the age of 18. It was illegal to have religious education, Sunday school, for anyone under 18. At that point in time, our experience was most of the churches were breaking that law. And most of them weren't being, again, this was in a different era, they weren't really facing much punishment. There was also a law against preaching about eschatology, so preaching from Revelation or end times. My observation, they were breaking that law too. The way that China has often functioned is rule of law. The ruler has always been above the law. So the law doesn't matter. They have law, but the law is often written intentionally vague so that the ruler can adjust it however he feels like. And so everybody gets up in the morning and puts a finger into the wind and which way is it blowing today? And then, okay, we'll try to do this. We'll try to get away with doing this. Until the wind changes, and then we got to change course and do that, right? That's how most people function. Now the wind is blowing really clearly in one direction. And so, in a way that wasn't in 2010, for example. So, sometimes the registered church, in my experience, there were lots of Bible-believing, Jesus-loving, faithful Christians in the registered church trying to do their best, trying to work around the law, trying to, but trying to operate. I think hopeful that things might continue to open, which unfortunately is not what happened. The opposite happened. So I actually am less in touch today with what the actual situation is in terms of if people are, if they're, I know the house churches are actually going to more like house churches again because they really do have to be secretive again because they're just under a lot more pressure than they were 15 years ago. So it's a good question. Any other questions along those lines? Or anything else? So I kind of, using his book, I kind of tried to boil his theology down to about 5 points. And his the first point I would say is he has a theology of the supremacy of Christ over all things. And again, his favorite passage that he refers to over and over is Colossians 1. And I think you're all familiar with that passage, right? Christ is the head of all things, the firstborn from the dead. We should read that. Somebody want to read Colossians 1:15 through 20? Because it's sort of the cornerstone of his theology in a lot of ways. And then he makes some interesting statements about Western, the rise of Western nation states, and he sees the modern Western nation state as sort of departure from what made the West successful for 2,000 years, that the West is now putting the supremacy of the nation state above. And he would argue that the First Amendment clause is a denial of the reality that God is actually sovereign over U.S. politics, and that there is no valid separation of the state from under the authority of God. Does that make sense? So he's issuing a challenge to China, of course, but he's also issuing a challenge to modern Western nations, although he admires them in many ways, but he feels like they are taking a wrong turn from the trajectory that they have inherited. Does that make sense? Okay, so the next main article of his theology is a theology of the cross, or a theology of suffering, and two of the favorite passages that the Chinese house church returns to often are Matthew 10 and John 15. And I'll just read. Matthew 10 says, "A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a servant above his master. If they have called the master of the house Beelzebub, how much more will they malign those of his household?" So if Jesus is our master and Jesus suffered, why would we think that we're not going to suffer? He says, "So have no fear of them." This is Jesus speaking. For nothing is covered that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. Do not fear those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. And John 15 is a similar ideas. If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you are of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Remember the word that I said to you, a servant is not greater than his master. That's a phrase they repeat all the time. If they persecuted me, they will also persecute you. So he sort of leans into the whole suffering thing as a sign that they're on the right track, basically. He says that Christians living under unjust governments will have to suffer just as Jesus suffered under a Roman Empire that did not recognize his reign. And eventually the suffering of the saints will be vindicated, and every earthly ruler will eventually stand naked before God's judgment throne. So really, he sees the Chinese church, I'm sure he's right about this, as in a situation much more similar to the early church between, say, the book of Acts and 300 AD, where under the Roman Empire was demanding worship, demanding that they recognize Caesar as a god. And the church said, obviously, we can't do that. And so that period of intense persecution of the church, they identify with that really closely. He says that, he writes in this book that God might someday give China a Constantine, like he gave to the West in 312, but they're not sitting around waiting for it, because it's not something over which they have any control. They would be happy for that to happen. He'd be happy for Xi Jinping to repent and embrace Jesus, but they're not sitting around waiting for that to happen. And then he says, until the Chinese government recognizes God's reign, he believes that the main role of the Chinese church is to suffer more, because a willingness to suffer is the highest form of worship, highest way of recognizing the worthiness of Christ. And it's the greatest testimony a person can give to the beauty of Christ, is to being willing to suffer for him. And then he says that in killing and persecuting Christians, the Chinese government merely shows their impotence over the consciences of believers. You can do what you want to my body, but you're impotent to actually touch me at my core, right? And then he says, their persecution of the church merely hastens their judgment day, when Christ's triumph will be revealed for everyone to see. So his thoughts on that, on this theology of suffering. They talk a lot about the cross-shaped life. I wouldn't call it some people would look at that and say, "Oh, you're being masochistic. Why pursue suffering?" They're not pursuing suffering for the good of suffering. They don't like suffering, but they see it as this is how we follow Jesus, right? Yeah, Doc.
It's just, it's difficult to look at his theological beliefs and find any fault with that.
Mm-hmm.
Practically, it's easy when you read these to understand how somebody who's running a church, would say, I believe in the supremacy of Christ. I believe that God has an active role in his if I'm obedient to him, at some point I will suffer for it. And then also say, well, it costs me nothing to register with the state. I can still believe in the supremacy of Christ. I can still believe that God has an active role in history. I can still preach the truth. And, it's not a sin for me to sign this paper and register with the state. And it seems like everybody who faces a tyrannical force is going to have a different point where they dig in their heels and say, this far, no farther. It's kind of neat that he's so unbending and so resolved. On the other hand, I guess that's the reason it's so remarkable, because everybody else that believes these things, basically everybody else, has a different breaking point than him.
Right. His views are not universal in the Chinese church. Like, actually, they're somewhat controversial. They're very well known because he's made them well known, and because he was a prominent guy. But there are Chinese Christians who think you're being a little bit too unbending about some of these, specifically about registering versus not registering.
But it seemed like to me, as I read the part of the book that I've read, that the ones who did register were liberal. And that's the way he presented it.
Yeah, it is the way he presents it.
It's got to be, if Ping is in control, why would he let people talk about, because the big thing with him is the nationalism. You thinking of the Chinese government as God, because it has everything to do with everything that you do.
Right.
How could you bow to that?
Right. So there is a live debate within the Chinese church and part of what's difficult too is conditions have changed, right?
And I think they have since you've been there.
They have changed significantly since we were there. Yeah.
So that I don't think that this registering is just something nothing.
Right. Is anybody in this room who went with me to, I don't think there's anybody here who went to Lijiang. We moved back to the U.S. in 2010, late 2010, and then I continued to take 2 or 3 trips to China until about 2016, about the time Xi Jinping came to power. That's when everything started to change. And between 2010 and 2016, we were working closely with a group of a church, a Chinese church that was entirely indigenous, meaning it was started by Chinese, it was Chinese led. There was no Western missionaries in the leadership at all. Never had been. They were a house church from a large house church network in north central China that planted a church in far southwest China because it was a minority region, where we were also working because it was a minority region, where there's lots of Christians among the Han majority people. Among the Chinese ethnic minorities, much lower rates of church, of Christians. And so they were planting a church in the same place that we were working to plant churches. And we sort of rubbed shoulders with them and thought, we really like these people. We're on the same team. We're going in the same direction. So we started working together. And they were a house church network. So they came to this area as a house, planted a couple of churches as house churches, but meeting openly in rented office space, but not secretly. This was early 2010s, right? 2010 to 2016. But the government there kept urging them to register. Just register, get legal, and then you can keep doing what you're doing. So eventually the church said, or the local government said, if you don't register, we're going to shut down all your meeting places. So they said, okay, we'll just register. But they kept doing everything that they were doing before, like an aggressive Sunday school program, aggressive evangelism, aggressive worship and outreach. Like they became registered on paper, but they didn't change any of they still had the heart of kind of the heart and soul of a house church, but they had on paper, on our wall, we're registered, right? Now, I think today, they did that because they felt like that would give them a little bit more operating room. Today, we've intentionally stopped contacting them because it would not be good for them at this point. It's why we don't go there anymore, because it would not be helpful. It would be more detrimental than helpful. But I don't actually know what their condition is today. I'm guessing that it's a lot more difficult. But this is one of those weird. I tell you, there's cross-pollination, because there was a lot of cross-pollination. There was people just trying to figure out how can we keep doing what we're doing and get the government off our back. So for them, registering was not a theological statement. It was just a way to, how can we not lose our church building? how can we keep meeting and not get busted up, right? And I don't fault them for that. I don't know what, well, I think Wang Yi probably would fault them for that. So I'm not going to jump in the middle of that argument, because I'm sitting in a very I'm safely ensconced in a very free situation. So, but that, just so you know, that is a live debate within China. And the debate changes as the conditions change, right? So, good questions. Let me wrap this up. Point 4 is, he has a theology of nonviolent resistance, but also very public resistance. I think this guy probably, when I think of it, I think a little bit of our Gracie. Probably a very strong-willed child. I'm guessing he probably didn't like to eat his vegetables, and his mom probably had to beat him over the head with a wooden spoon frequently. He's a very principled person. As we told Gracie, like, God gave you your strong will. You just got to harness it to His will, and then you'll go far. Right? So he talks about a resistance that's not an angry resistance or a fearful resistance. It's a joyful resistance, because we know how the story ends. We may have to go through a bunch of bad stuff to get there, but we know that it's a privilege to suffer like Jesus suffered. He believes that as nation states, including Western nation states, as they continue to metastasize and become more like China, as they reject God, they will increasingly demand people's worship. And more people are going to face the same things that Chinese Christians are now facing. Interestingly, he specifically does not call for rebellion against the Chinese government. He says he believes that God has sovereignly appointed the Chinese leadership. Xi Jinping is just like, he compares him to Pharaoh a lot. Moses, like Pharaoh hardened his heart, and then God hardened his heart. And that was in order to demonstrate the power of God over the gods of Egypt and over the deity of the Pharaoh, right? So he, instead of calling for a pulling down of the Chinese government. He says he calls for nonviolent resistance and non-compliance to laws that try to force primary allegiance to the party, the Communist Party versus the church. Here's a direct quote. He says, "House churches have never rebelled, rioted, or incited to subvert the rule of the Communist Party. Prayer is the church's secret weapon. If an individual is ruled by a king who has risen from the dead, what does it matter if he's temporarily under an unjust government? This light and momentary affliction cannot impair our eternal weight of glory. Compared to our future glory, the persecution of the Communist Party is nothing more than a mosquito bite. The cross has shattered the curse that all dreams have to be fulfilled before death. Those who have been crucified with Christ can live in death instead of being dead while living." That's a direct quote. It's really powerful. In one encounter with a Communist Party official, he said directly to this individual, and I think he speaks joyfully, not angrily. He said, "The eternal destiny of mankind is beyond the jurisdiction of your government. But I would love for you to rule China until our Lord Jesus comes again, for it is very troublesome and dangerous to change the government." And then a fifth point to his theology is the centrality of the church. He says the church is God's greatest gift to Chinese society, even if they don't recognize it. The church is the voice of conscience to the state. It's the Nathan speaking to David. It's the Samuel speaking to Saul. It's Isaiah speaking to King Ahaz. So he says, warning the state of the consequences of its false claims to deity, even as the church works for the good of society as an act of loving our neighbor and following Jesus. So I'm going to close with, I'm going to skip a little bit here because we're running out of time. Well, I do like this. He says, every one of the world's great empires has been confronted by God's truth. Egypt and Moses, Israel and Babylon, Persia, Jesus and Rome. He says, today the front line of this battle is China. China is the new Pharaoh shaking its fist at God. He hopes that Pharaoh will not continue to harden his heart. In ancient times, all pagan societies assumed that the spiritual order in heaven was the same as the political order on earth. The king and his kingdom were to be worshipped because the king was appointed by the gods, and the gods must be placated in order for good harvests. But Christ proved that all these gods are fake, and any king who pretends to deity is an impostor. All kings must bow and acknowledge their true king. One thing that was convicting to me is during COVID, obviously first hit in China, in Wuhan, and he said when COVID hit the Chinese church, their first response was not to the government, take your hands off of my rights, or to feel like victims of injustice. Their first response was, how can we get more of our neighbors into church? How can we get more of our neighbors into the kingdom? How can we advance the kingdom of God? How can we plant more churches? This is just another speed bump. I'll close with a prayer that he closed one of his chapters with. He says, Lord, grant a great revival to your church in China. Raise up a large number of servants to face a new round of persecution until the gospel fills every prison. Or take away our properties, our degrees, our middle-class lifestyle, lest one day we come to meet you with only those things. Let us be passive and non-cooperative in Chinese society, but be active in the preaching of the gospel. Let us not envy the wicked, nor fear the powerful. In the holy name of our Lord Jesus Christ, amen. So I'd commend this book to you. I also have about a 30-minute interview with the editors of this book, not with Wang Yi himself. He's in jail. He's in jail right now as we speak. So pray for him. There's very few reports getting out. His wife has not been allowed to visit him, so it's assumed he may not be in great condition. I'm sure he's not well treated, but
Is her name wrong? Is that how you pronounce her wrong?
I don't remember her given name. Yeah. So, but that you'd really enjoy watching that YouTube interview with the editors of this book. Appreciate you guys for hanging with us for this whole experience. I really enjoyed it. Hope it was beneficial to you as well. And any closing thoughts or yeah, Lynn.
We watched, what's the name, a movie last night of Wurmbrand and how he was tortured for Christ. His name
Yeah,
was.
Richard Wurmbrand. Yeah.
And him and his wife both were in prison for 14 years in slavery, and I just had to ask myself, I wonder if I would respond as well as they did.
Yeah.
They were bold.
Yeah.
They shouldn't be.
Yeah, you can't read that stuff and not ask. You're like, what would I do in that situation?
I'm really wondering.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. Starting next week, there's going to be a women's Sunday school class. Jamie, where will you guys be meeting?
I think we're back here.
With maybe back there?
I think, yeah.
Okay.
Small, but I guess I'm not. I don't know if it's been officially decided
Okay.
yet.
And then there's,
Show up and we'll
yeah, there's going to be a parenting class that's open to anybody. The men's class will not resume until we get the use of the new wing, which should be mid-March, hopefully. So starting in mid-March, I think the men are going to jump back into 1st and 2nd Kings. We'll not totally decided on that yet, but that's kind of leaning toward at this point. So, final thoughts? Or?
I think we can fall into putting our hope in this new administration.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I
In
think
any
we
administration,
have to,
yeah. No, there's no human leader is going to solve all of our problems. Not Donald Trump, not anybody else. Jesus Christ is a human leader who can solve our problems, but he's the only one. So yeah. JJ, would you close us in prayer?